So, greetings, fellow philosophers. I want to talk today again about a great philosopher whose name is Hegel. And he usually doesn't have many quotes that are really great. I never heard this one before. I never encountered it, but I think it speaks something that is true. So he says, genuine tragedies in the world are not conflicts between right and wrong. They're conflicts between two rights. And it addresses this view that statements that we utter are usually one side of the truth. And very often it's opposite, but we have to say it's dialectical opposite, belongs to it. Now, of course, it is very difficult to sometimes figure out whether two opinions are really just two sides of a dialectical coin. But in my experience, it has been in many cases. Nevertheless, I don't want to focus on this particular quote. Actually, I want to read together with you the history of philosophy. Actually, Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy. And there's something that comes to the fore right at the beginning. It is a contradiction that he discovers in the word, the history of philosophy itself. And he writes, the thought which first occurs to us in the history of philosophy is that the subject itself contains an inner contradiction. So what does he say? When we say history of philosophy, that's a contradiction. So why is it a contradiction? He explains, for philosophy aims at understanding what is unchangeable. Philosophy has the universal in mind, not the particular organism, not the particular phenomenon that appears and vanishes. It wants to grasp what really is. Therefore, he writes further, its end is truth. But history tells us of that which has at one time existed, at another time has vanished, having been expelled by something else. So we have philosophy that focuses on what truly is. It wants to figure out what is truth. And history, it tells us about vanishing phenomena. That seems to be the contradiction. And there are again two positions that could now struggle with each other. And in a sense, both of them are right. He expounds, truth is eternal. It does not fall within the sphere of the transient and has no history. 1 + 1 = 2. A equals A equals A equals A for all time. It never changes. But if it has a history, if truth has a history, and as this history is only the representation of a succession of past forms of knowledge, the truth is not to be found in it, for the truth cannot be what has passed away. So here he just demonstrates an argument ad absurdum. Okay, he says, okay, we have here truth is eternal, it has no history, but let's assume it has a history. Okay, and as this history is only as the history of truth, it just shows a succession of past forms of knowledge, right? Then actually we couldn't find the truth in these successions of knowledge, because truth, very simple, cannot be something that passes away. So this is the contradiction we are dealing with in the history of philosophy. And we could say we have here, though we usually don't use it, a thesis and an antithesis. And Hegel sometimes says it needs more synthesis, right? So let me just type that. Hegel needs more synthesis. Let's see whether we find a meme. I have a bit the idea that we find a Simpsons meme. I saw that before. Let me open that in an own image so that it's not so confusing. Here we have it. We have here antithesis, and thesis, and Hegel tests it, and he says, needs more synthesis. Okay, just a joke on the sidelines. Let's get back to Hegel. Turn this off, okay. So let's go on in the text. It might be said that all this argument would affect not only the other sciences, but in like degree the Christian religion, and it might be found inconsistent that a history of this religion and of the other sciences should exist. But it would be superfluous further to examine this argument, for it is immediately contradicted by the very fact that there are such histories. Okay, I have to understand this here, okay. So somebody may say, they don't say it, but that this argument would not affect all the sciences, but it would also affect Christianity. And why is it important for Christianity? Because Jesus was a historical person that brought truth to the earth, and before Jesus had come, there was no truth. That's how we have to imagine Christianity, right? And so I think Hegel does here something very similar to Aquinas. He says something like, yeah, but isn't that an example where both of that comes together? However, he says then, but it would be superfluous further to examine this argument, for it is immediately contradicted by the very fact that there are such histories. So we have histories where truth is really brought into the world. And Jesus would be such an example. Hegel was a Christian. So it's a bit questionable still whether Hegel really existed or not. Jesus really existed or not. So in that sense, this argument is not very much carrying, or it's not very, solid, because there may be people who don't believe in Christianity, right? So, and therefore, let's drop this argument. But in order to get a better understanding of this apparent contradiction, we must distinguish between the outward history of a religion or a science and the history of the subject itself. So he introduces here first distinction. We have something where something is brought to our awareness, and then a history of the subject of how it is developed itself. And this is what we also have to keep in mind. So for example, we might develop the idea that 500 plus 500 is 100. And we might tell a story about the people who discovered that fact, right? But then there's also a story of how we actually came to the idea that 500 plus 500 equals 100. And this may be grounded in the idea that there are numbers that we first develop, and then we develop simple operations like 1 plus 1 equals 2, and we extend that any further, and we say then with logical necessity that that also applies to larger numbers, so that we can conclude that. That would be a history of the subject, right? Two sides of how we can look at it, like the outward history of a subject and the internal history of a subject. It is at once evident that the contradiction in question could not refer to the outward history. So we are really not concerned with the outward history where we deal with this contradiction. So philosophy, which is eternal and has a history, is not really interested in the particular life of, let's say, Aristotle or Socrates, though we are interested in these philosophers, but merely to the inward or to that of the content itself. And likewise, there is a history of the spread of Christianity and of the lives of those who have evoked it, and its existence has formed itself into that of a church. This in itself constitutes an external existence, such that being brought into contact with temporal affairs of the more diverse kind, its lot is a varied one, and it essentially possesses a history. And of the Christian doctrine, it is true that it too has its history, but it necessarily soon reached its full development and attained to its appointed powers. And this old creed has been acknowledged to influence to every age and will still be acknowledged unchanged as the truth, even though this acknowledgement will become no more than a pretense and the words an empty form. So we have a history of the church, which is outward, but then we also have a development of the internal subject, which then becomes acknowledged as a truth. And if it really is truthfully acknowledged as a truth, it will remain as such a truth. And this would be even the case if people just do that in a very formal way and just do it as an empty form. But the history of this doctrine in its wider sense includes two elements. First, the various additions to and deviations from the truth formally established, and secondly, the combating of these errors, the purification of the principles that remain from such additions, and a consequent return to their first simplicity. Okay, what does he say here? The way I understand it is that we develop a truth and then it becomes confused again in the history of the many lives that people lead, and that then through this confusion we have to discover this truth again to return to its first simplicity that it had. And so in this sense, the process of discovering the truth is always part of the truth itself, though it does not constitute its unchangeable essence. The question is whether we ever reach the simplicity, the simple essence of what truth really is. If there's ever an end of the debate, which brings us back to the first quote that I had mentioned, the first citation of Hegel that we discussed. And that was really, now I've probably searched it away. Yeah, so that the genuine tragedies in the world are not conflicts between right and wrong, they are conflicts between two rights. Because the point is that discussing aspects from two perspectives is necessary for reaching the truth. And it's a tragedy if people don't acknowledge that discourse is a necessary part of this world, and we should embrace it in a sense. Yeah, we should actually finish here. This is a good point to finish. Thank you very much. I will read this a little bit more. I hope you get some insights from it. If you want to follow me. So this will be on my channel where I have more messy thoughts, where I basically just post different stuff that concerns me from an intellectual perspective. I don't expect anyone to follow, but it would be nice if you give it a like, or if you follow me, or if you write your opinions. I'm very happy if people attempt to discuss with me. Not in a conflict like, you are wrong! More like, okay, what is the truth? What is the truth? Maybe my Hegel interpretation is very controversial, yes.